Hello there, everybody. Welcome back to my channel, Boomy Reactions. For those of you who are new, my name's Boomy. And thank you for watching. Now, today, guys, I'm going to be watching Mr. Ballen. I need my weekly dose of Ballen. Sorry, that sounded really weird. So, admittedly, I prefer his stories that are more paranormal, supernatural kind of based, as opposed to the real life crime ones. I don't know what it is. I think because obviously they're real life crimes, and I feel so much for the families of the victims, and that's where my mind goes. Whereas when it's the paranormal, the more ghostly, unexplainable ones, I think I like that there's no definitive explanation for what has actually happened here. It's all speculative, and everyone's got different theories. And you know, I'm a big freak, and I love anything to do with the paranormal. So I do have a little bit of a preference towards those stories of Mr. Ballen, the ghost stories, the ghoulish ones. You can just imagine, can't you, sitting around a campfire and Mr. Ballen, you're toasting some marshmallows, and Mr. Ballen's there telling you the story. He's such a good storyteller. And I don't know, it plays out in my mind. All the visuals are there, and it just plays out like a little bit like a film. Anyway, done enough blabbing. Let's watch the video. So today's video is called "This is Why You Never Search for the Dead." Sounds very ominous, doesn't it? So this is Boomy's choice today. This is my choice. I was looking through his videos, and the title just called to me. Because like I say, I'm weird and I love anything to do with supernatural stuff. Oh my gosh. Let's watch the video, guys. And as ever, if you are enjoying these reactions, my lovelies, please consider liking and subscribing. Thank you so much. If you're interested, my lovelies, I have a Buy Me a Coffee account, and that link is over here.
Today, I'm going to share with you 3 extremely haunting stories about people who witnessed death up close, and then how that experience completely altered their entire perspective about what is possible in life. But
Ooh. Do you know, I imagine if you ever have the unfortunate encounter with the Grim Reaper, with death, I imagine I would have thought it made you quite fearless. Like, once you've experienced that, what else is there to be afraid of? Maybe I'm totally wrong. Obviously, I've never had a near-death experience, and I'm quite fortunate actually in my life to not have experienced an awful lot of loved ones passing away. So I'm very sheltered from that aspect of life. But I would have thought maybe it made you quite fearless as someone who's a very anxious person about absolutely everything. You know, having one less thing to worry about ultimately would be great. But I don't know, for any of viewers out there that have had one of these experiences, can you agree with that? Or I don't know, how does it change you?
before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we help each other climb over the gate. And once they were on the other side, they took off running straight down the cemetery path. And eventually, after running for a minute, they got to the other side of the cemetery, and they came to a stop outside of a brick mausoleum that contained the remains of a man named Ephraim Gray, who had died 20 years earlier. So for years, James and William had been hearing all these rumors about this guy, Ephraim. In fact, many of their classmates had heard these rumors, and some people really believed they could be true. But tonight, James and William had snuck in here to this mausoleum to once and for all prove that those rumors were false. According to the rumors, when Ephraim was alive, so 20 years earlier, he'd been this very reclusive chemist who lived in a big house in the middle of town, and he had this one servant. And anytime people walked past his house, apparently they would always smell this really pungent chemical scent. And people believed that what Ephraim was doing in there to produce that smell was basically trying to come up with a potion that would make him immortal. He was basically running these strange experiments. However, clearly his experiments had not worked, because Ephraim had died anyway. But when he died, his one servant had told the mortician not to embalm him, which was very unusual at the time. This was not a normal request.
His ego to his Frankenstein. This is like a ghost story within a ghost story. I love that. So we've had the ghost story that's been told to all of these youngsters years ago. And then this is the ghost story. Oh, I like that. Oh, it's a bit trippy. Okay, so Ephraim, I thought that was going in a different direction. You know, the search for immortality, it's quite a common pursuit of alchemists and philosophers and scientists alike. Okay. I thought he was going to say that pungent smell was a result of necromancy or something like that. You know, something. Obviously, my mind is far too dark. It went to a much darker place. But okay, I mean, what could he have been doing? And what that smell could have been like ammonia or sulfury, a bit eggy.
The serpent had said that, you know, even though Ephraim's elixir had not actually succeeded in keeping him alive forever, it had been successful at making his physical body immortal. The servant said apparently Ephraim's body would never decay. And so this story had become sort of a local legend.
Never decay or not age. Maybe he's found like the fountain of youth, and you know, whatever age it was that he passed away. Maybe he like passed away at the age of 60, but he had the Adonis physique of like a 25-year-old man.
And decades later, lots of people in the area, you know, in particular in Harvard Medical School, students actually believed it might be true, or they at least pretended it could be true. It was fun to believe. But James, like, as much as he wanted to, you know, go along with the story, logically he felt like there is simply no way there could be any truth to this story. As a medical student, he knew that even the very best embalming techniques would only preserve a dead body for a few weeks at most. So there was no way Ephraim's body, you know, that had been dead now for 2 decades, was not a pile of bones by now. And tonight, they were going to go find out. James knelt down in front of the mausoleum where Ephraim was entombed. And William struck a match and lit the lantern he had brought with him. And immediately, the light from the lantern, it illuminated the door that led into the mausoleum.
The lantern? A lantern? What time era is this? I missed that. I know he did say early on in the video, but there's a good chance I was probably talking. I do that an awful lot. So what are we talking, like I was thinking 1980s, but that's just my television influenced brain. That just tends to be the time era where a lot of these ghost stories take place. Maybe he'll mention it again.
And they saw it was sealed shut with a padlock. So James, who's knelt down right next to the door, he pulled out a small hammer and a chisel, and he began to work on this lock. And eventually, he popped it open, he took the lock and put it on the ground, and then he stood up, and he and William were like, all right, here we go. And they pushed the door, and it slowly swung open. James stepped inside first, with William right behind him, holding up the lantern. And the space was cold and musty, and it was this kind of claustrophobic, you know, all brick space that was covered in cobwebs. And on each side of the inside of this mausoleum were these big shelves with caskets sitting on each shelf. These were all different relatives of Ephraim's. And there were nameplates attached to each of these caskets. And so very quickly, James and William, they began looking, you know, for the right casket that contained Ephraim. And eventually they found the right one, and they're sort of nervous at this point, but they're like, all right. And they got to either side of this casket, and together they pulled it off the shelf and put it down on the floor. And so James and William, they both went to the same side of the casket. And William, he's holding up his lantern, and they look at each other. They're like, all right, here we go. And James reaches down, and he opens up the casket.
Not what everyone else might be thinking here, but I would be reluctant to do this for a number of reasons, obviously. Defiling the dead and whatnot. It's not very honorable, is it? But one thing that would always be in the back of my mind is, what would the smell be like? Am I the only absolute weirdo that thinks of things like that? I imagine there is a very, very odious thing to do. No?
And when they see what's inside, can't believe it. Inside of this casket was definitely Ephraim's dead body. But even though Ephraim's clothing had clearly decayed into stringy brown mush, Ephraim himself did not look like he had been dead for 20 years. His skin was white and smooth, and there were no signs of decomposition on his body whatsoever. He was pristine. In fact, he looked like he was just sleeping, like he could just open his eyes and he'd be just fine. And so James and William are so spooked by this that they just instantly slam shut the casket, they turn, and they sprint out of the mausoleum, they flee the cemetery, and they pledge to never talk about this again.
Why would that freak you out to the point where it's like, oh my God, run away, run away? I would be in awe, obviously. You'd be absolutely amazed, you'd be gobsmacked. Would I be thoroughly spooked? No, because there's got to be a reason. Like the rumor is that the story that, Ephraim had experimented with the fountain of youth, immortality. If he had achieved it, he's obviously still deceased. So at best, he's just come up with one hell of a anti-age elixir. Can I get one of those, please? I wouldn't say that would make me absolutely run away in horror, flailing my arms going, okay.
However, for the next few months, James just could not get the image of Ephraim's impossibly well-preserred body out of his head. Now, he still didn't believe the rumors that somehow, it's because of some potion that Ephraim drank that's made his body immortal or something. But he read every chemistry book in the Harvard Library and could not find a scientific explanation for what he had seen. At the same time, James had another stress, which was he knew the Malden police were investigating the break-in at the mausoleum. And he was terrified that at some point, he and William were going to be found out. Desecrating a grave was a crime. Yes. And if James was actually arrested for it, he would get kicked out of medical school. But weeks turned into months, turned into years, and no police showed up at his door. So nobody figured out that he or William were involved in this break-in. And also, over this time, over these many years, he never figured out what actually had caused Ephraim's body to be that well preserved. But eventually, they just moved on with their lives. James graduated, he became a doctor, and he really just sort of forgot about the Ephraim thing. He just moved on. Okay. Until 30 years later, in 1900. At that point,
in 1900. Oh, there we go. Okay. Shut up, Boomy. It's not 1980. That is why they have a lantern. Okay. I understand. So daft. Okay, so it was like 1870, more or less. That is, okay, yeah, that explains the lantern.
James was in his 50s, and he was a successful doctor with his own medical practice in Boston. And one day, he was sitting in his office, catching up on some paperwork, when he heard a knock at the door. And so he called for whoever was out there to come in, and when the door opened up, he was very surprised to see a police officer. The officer told James that he was from the Malden Police Department, and he was looking into an unsolved break-in at the cemetery from 30 years earlier. Immediately, James felt sick to his stomach, and he was about to just start lying, saying he had nothing to do with it. But before he could say anything, the officer just said, look, multiple people in town have already told us that you and your friend William were responsible for that break-in.
They knew all along. Oh, I bet they thought they were so slick and so sneaky. No, everyone knew what they'd done. Okay.
At this point, James knew he was caught, and there was no point in lying. Clearly, this officer knows what actually happened. And so James just rushed to explain sort of why they did it. He just said, look, there were these rumors that the body of Ephraim Gray didn't decompose because he apparently drank some, immortality potion, and we thought it was crazy. So we broke in just to look at the body. We just opened the casket, looked at the body, we shut it, we ran out, that was it. But the officer, after hearing this story, just narrowed his eyes and stared at James like he didn't believe him. And then when the officer went on to explain exactly why now, 30 years later, they were taking another look at this break-in, when he explained that,
body is gone.
James literally just could not believe what he was hearing. So it would turn out the Malden Cemetery was in the process of being relocated. So workers were going through and moving every single grave. But when they got to Ephraim Gray's casket, they noticed it was unusually light. So they opened it up and found it was empty. There was no sign that anybody except for James and William had ever tampered with that mausoleum. And so basically, James and William were being accused of stealing Ephraim's body. But they both swore they didn't do that. They said they just went in, they looked at the body, were shocked that it had not decomposed, and they ran out. They didn't take the body.
No. However, they have broken into the mausoleum and they have left it unlocked, open to the elements, open to any potential grave robbers or worse, or from the time. So even if they didn't steal the body, they have potentially allowed that crime to be committed by other people. So they're still kind of responsible. Ooh.
But police, during their investigation, saw that nobody else tampered with this casket except for James and William. Okay. So where did the body go? It was almost like Ephraim had simply woken up one day, looking as fresh as ever, opened up his coffin, and just
25-year-old Adonis.
And despite all of James and William's skepticism and all their medical training, they couldn't help but wonder if maybe somehow Ephraim's immortality potion had finally kicked in.
Ooh, what do you think, guys? Oh, just before we move on to the second one. I think that can be explained probably in a few different ways. Like I say, the fellas, they've broken in, they've left the crypt, mausoleum, whatever you want to call it. They've left that not secured. They've left it unlocked, opened. So if you had grave robbers, or I don't know what you want to call them, if people that were stealing bodies for medical purposes to sell to the medical institutions, to trainee surgeons. If you had come along to this graveyard and you were looking for graves to do that to, and you come across an open mausoleum, slow hanging fruit, do you know what I mean? It's too easy. It's almost someone set it up for you to do. So I think you could probably explain it like that. Maybe I think he probably looked immaculate. I don't think that's spooky. I think, I don't know, he could have coated his skin in something which dramatically slowed down the decomposition process. Yeah, obviously looked like a 25-year-old when he died. Whatever he was researching, I think it should be looked into, because you never know. We could have the elixir of life, not necessarily immortality, but definitely, one of the best anti-aging serums on the market. Can I pre-order mine, please? Very odd conditions. Story number 2.
On the afternoon of January 28, 1945, an Australian reporter named Robert Cheney sat on a wooden bench inside of a small, cramped room in a swelteringly hot church in Brazil. He was squeezed shoulder to shoulder with several other reporters and a few doctors who were wearing white coats. All the lights were off in this church, and there was this religious hymn that was playing on a phonograph, which is like an early record player. And on the other side of the room, standing in front of a heavy locked door, were these two people, these two psychic mediums, who were twisting and groaning as if they were in pain. So the reason that Robert and everybody else, the other reporters, the doctors, were gathered here today was because of what was happening inside of that locked room. there was a man in there who was having his appendix removed. Now, usually, appendix removal was a routine surgery, and it would be performed without an audience and in a hospital instead of a back room in a church. But
not the nicest of things to go through. I've been there. Appendicitis. Not nice.
This operation was being performed by a very, very famous surgeon named Dr. Louise Gomes. And Dr. Gomes had only agreed to do the surgery under a couple of very odd conditions. So first, it had to be done in this church. Second, no one else could enter the operating room, so that backed locked room, while he was working. Not even nurses or anesthesiologists. Nobody.
This is an appendectomy, not an exorcism. That's right. It sounds like somebody's about to be exorcised.
And third, the only people Dr. Gomes would communicate with during this operation were those two psychic mediums standing outside the door. They wouldn't even be in the room with him, they'd be outside. And so after all these conditions were agreed to, before the surgery, the two mediums worked with the doctor to gather all the supplies and made sure they were in the back room.
Maybe the doctor had decided that this patient's appendix had been possessed. And that's it. It is an exorcism, but it is also an appendectomy. I don't know. I can't explain this.
And then also they strapped the patient down to the operating table in the back room, and then they came out again. And then at that point, the reporter, Robert Cheney, and the other witnesses that were there to see this, the other reporters, the doctors, they helped board up all the windows of this back room of the church. And they also searched for any hidden passageways to make sure nobody could look into or sneak into or out of this back room, the operating room. And so eventually everything was ready, and Dr. Gomes and the patient were the only two people inside of this back operating room. It was all sealed off and locked.
Dodgy going on here.
And then the instructions had been given to, Robert Cheney and the others to just take your seats in the church and wait. And so that's what Cheney and the others did. They just sat there, sort of listening and watching, and nothing was going on. There's just this hymn playing from the phonograph, and the mediums are doing like weird stuff in front of the door, apparently communicating with the doctor, but the whole thing was just sort of absurd. Honestly, Robert didn't really know what to make of this. But when he had caught wind that there was gonna be this totally bizarre procedure done, he had come here not to validate that this was a smart or good way to do a surgery, but rather that this would just make a really wild story that people would be interested to read. But the longer Robert sat there listening and watching this totally bizarre scene unfold, the more he felt like he had sort of bitten off more than he could chew, that this was not really worth the time or energy. This was just really, really weird. However, as he's sitting there, sweating in the heat, just sort of waiting for this thing to be over, whatever it was, he overheard a couple of the doctors who were witnesses to this, along the pew with him, talking about Dr. Gomes. And what Robert heard is that these doctors are like, there is no way Dr. Gomes can perform this surgery. Like, he's not capable of performing this surgery. It's not possible. Not to.
Why? An appendectomy is quite a standard surgery. Even, in the 1940s, it's not I don't think it's a complicated surgery. It's normally ones that they give to trainees, isn't it? The trainee surgeons. Why are they claiming that there's no way that he can do it? There's more to this. This isn't just an appendectomy. They're talking about doing something crazy, like pioneering surgery, or, purely hypothetical. They're talking about like trying to transfer the soul. A soul transplant. This is not just appendicitis.
Mentioned, the doctors are also saying that, like, generally speaking, attempting to perform an appendectomy by yourself with no anesthesia, no nurses, no techs to help,
there we go.
was also just a terrible idea. Let alone, again, Dr. Gomes can't do this. There's no.
Why would you want to perform it without anesthesia? I woke up after mine and I was just sick. And the pain from being sick after having, abdominal surgery, it's not nice. You could not do that. Why would we even want to?
No way. And so Robert, after hearing these doctors talk, he he started to feel like, oh man, this whole thing's really unsettling. Like now it's just creepy. The sound of him and the mediums writhing around, presumably communicating with this famous doctor through the locked door. And it's like, please let this end. This is so awful. And he was just staring over at the mediums and the locked door, and suddenly the mediums just stopped. But Robert just continued to sit there with the other witnesses for over another hour. They've been in there now for like 2+ hours, and it's just this horrible scene. But eventually this booming voice came out of the back room. The doors weren't open yet. The voice was just coming from inside of that room, and the voice yelled that the operation was now over. Robert at this point looked over at those two doctors who had sort of voiced their own concerns, and they kind of exchanged a look like, what are we gonna see in there? But they had waited this long, they really wanted to see, so they all stood up and they made their way over to the door. When they got to the door, the two mediums stepped out of the way, and then one of the two doctors that was with Robert, they just reached down and tried the door handle, and they found it was now unlocked. And so the lights are on at this point inside the church. This is the first time they're gonna see what's inside of this, magical operating room, and they open the door, and the doctors walk in, and Robert follows right behind them, and they look around. And at first it was just really weird. Like there was really nothing strange in the room. The patient is right in the middle of the room. He's on an operating table. He has fresh stitches right on his side, suggesting he's just had surgery. And literally next to him on the table is a jar with his appendix sitting inside of it, floating in liquid.
Guys, I had seen this as a child growing up, just watching TV. And I had seen little cartoons like Rocko's Modern Life, I think is the one that I'm thinking of. And after their appendectomy, they have their little appendix in a jar. And I cannot describe the disappointment that I felt when I'd asked the doctors about this, and they said that they were just stared at me blankly like, why would you want that? We don't do that. Ew. It's on its way to the incinerator. Who wants to keep their appendix? I was so disappointed, guys. I just wanted to look at it, just for a minute or two. I'm not saying I wanted to keep it. I was so disappointed.
The surgery had been a success. The patient was okay. However, there was a catch. The surgeon, the famous surgeon, Dr. Gomes, was nowhere to be seen. He was not back here. And the reason is because Dr. Luis Gomes was dead. He died 19 years earlier. And it was because the surgeon was dead that all these people, Robert, the two doctors, the other reporters, it's why they were brought here, to bear witness to this unbelievable thing. Because the people who organized this knew that if they didn't have witnesses, nobody would ever believe that this was the
ghost of the doctor.
Even though a dozen witnesses, including Robert Cheney, those doctors, the other reporters, were there in the church that day, and they swore that no living doctor ever went in that back room. They didn't go in during, before, after the surgery. Nobody came out, even though they swore, basically, that the patient was effectively alone in that room. Despite that, X-rays would confirm that the patient had an appendectomy on that day, that his appendix really was removed, and apparently it was removed by a very highly skilled surgeon. And so this remains the only surgery on record to have been officially performed by a ghost.
No, I don't believe that. That's silly. No, that could not have happened. I think this is a hack. This is a con. Someone has obviously done it. And I don't know why they felt the need to make such a spectacle of it. Channeling the deceased doctor? What? So they're saying his ghost did the surgery? Or, oh, come on. At the very least, they could try and say, we have a medical student. He's going to be possessed by the ghost of the deceased surgeon, and he's going to carry out the surgery using the body of the medical student. Ever so much more slightly believable. If you were going to fool everyone, if you were going to play that trick, that's the route I would take. No, oh, no. This has been debunked. I bet. Has it? If anyone knows, let me know in the comments because that's actually quite interesting. But I'm more interested in, I don't know, I want to know what actually happened because I do not believe for a single second that this actually happened. Not the way that they're explaining it anyway. But it's more the fact that they, yeah, like I said, they make such a spectacle out of it and they've got journalists over. I want to know what happened. I want to know how they did it. Let me know. Bright blue eyes. Ooh.
At 5 a.m. on the morning of December 5th, 1957, a 74-year-old woman named Frances Bowles woke up in her bedroom near San Francisco, California. And before she opened her eyes, Frances just had this feeling, this sense, that somebody else was in the room with her.
Ugh.
But she wasn't bothered by this because she knew it had to be her husband, Gene. So Gene was 82 years old and he'd been really, really sick for the past couple of years.
Aww.
And recently he'd begun sleeping in their guest bedroom so he wouldn't wake Frances up with all his tossing and turning at night. But then in the mornings, he would often come and join her in bed. And so she's assuming that's what's going on. Gene must have joined me in the middle of the night and he's next to me in bed. However, when Frances did open her eyes, she saw there was someone else in the room, but it was not Gene. So Frances was lying on her side on the edge of the bed, looking outward. And her perspective, from her head, the way she was positioned, is she was sort of looking down towards the ground when she first opened her eyes. And the first thing she saw when she was looking off the side of the bed were these very distinctive shoes standing, with somebody's legs right next to the bed, basically standing facing her. And she sees these old-fashioned polished dress shoes with very thick heels and a piece of gray fabric buttoned over the ankles, like the way men used to wear back in the late 1800s. Like, these are distinctive and old shoes. And it was actually these shoes that immediately gave away that this was not Gene, because Gene did not own a pair of shoes like that. Frances would know. And as her eyes traveled up from these strange shoes, she saw this was clearly a man, and he had skinny legs, and he was wearing black and gray striped pants, and he had a very small body overall, and he was wearing a white vest with a long black coat with coattails. And then as Frances finally reached this man's head, she saw he had these strikingly blue eyes, and he was looking right at her, and he had this almost mocking grin on his face. And Frances has no idea who this person is. There is a stranger in her house. She's thinking he's broken in. What's he gonna do to me? And she just sat up in her bed and she looked at this guy and he leaned forward and he just kind of continued to smile and he said, "I'm here for Gene." Frances just began to scream at the top of her lungs. But this man, this strange little man with blue eyes, just began to laugh. And then to Frances's total disbelief, he vanished. A second later, Frances heard footsteps, and then the bedroom door flew open, and Gene burst in, asking what was wrong. And without thinking, Frances blurted out that there had been somebody in her room. But as she told Gene all about this strange little man and his weird outfit with his blue eyes, and how he vanished, she started to realize that what she was saying sounded absurd. And from Gene's expression, she could tell that he did not believe her. He's thinking, you were having a dream, clearly, like there's no way this happened. And so even though to Frances, the experience she had just had felt 100% real, by the time she was done telling the story and sort of going over it with Gene, she was starting to think that, maybe she had like a very lucid, vivid dream.
Yeah, that'd be my first kind of justification, maybe. The dreams can feel really, really real. Maybe, she was just kind of coming to, regaining consciousness, but you're not unconscious when you're asleep. You know what I mean? As you're just kind of waking up. And I don't know, like sometimes if you're in like a dazed state, like kind of half dream, it feels really real.
However, just to be safe, Frances and Gene spent a few minutes walking all around the house, making sure nobody else was here, and
peace of
also
mind.
looking for, any signs that maybe somebody had broken in, but there were none. However, Gene did find that the front door was unlocked, which definitely was not something he did. He remembered locking the door before bed, and Frances said she never unlocked it, so that was sort of a strange thing. But other than that, the house was in normal order. And so Frances and Jean, they didn't really know what to do. I mean, they did debate calling the police, but they had no evidence that this actually happened.
Yeah.
And they both agreed that the story was just too strange for anyone to believe.
I suppose there's no damage, there's no crime been committed if you can't prove that anyone was really there, so.
And so by 7 a.m. that morning, so just a little while after this whole thing happened, Frances felt pretty convinced that there had been no little man in a room with blue eyes.
Yeah.
And this really had just been a very lucid, horrible dream. And so the two of them began to go about their normal morning routine when Jean really started to feel sick. I mean, he was already not doing well in the weeks prior, but he really just started to deteriorate really quickly. This is like 15, 20 minutes after this little man has popped up in her nightmare or whatever.
You're calling him the little man.
Jean starts falling apart to the point where Frances actually called his doctor and said, "You gotta come here right now. Something's wrong with Jeannie. He's fallen apart here." By 8 a.m., when the doctor showed up, this is now about an hour after, Frances has had whatever experience she had, whether it was a nightmare or real, they don't know. But this is an hour later, the doctor shows up, and by this point, Jean is like wrecked. He's practically on his deathbed. He's falling apart. He gets rushed to the hospital, and all day that day, they're trying to save him. But by the very next morning, he had died. And then as time went on, whenever she would think about that strange experience, the little man in her room, she would just rationalize it and tell herself that that was just her own mind's way of working out her growing anxiety over Jean's mortality. I mean, after all, he had died literally within 24 hours of that vision, and so maybe that was just her mind's way of getting ready for Jean's death.
Yeah.
However, despite telling herself the story and feeling pretty good about that being what this whole thing was, what she could never quite figure out was how her subconscious had created such a strange character with such a weirdly specific wardrobe.
This is weird. So normally, I don't think you could ever dream about somebody that you hadn't met or hadn't seen on TV or through in a magazine or whatever. You don't just generate a face and then you create this fictional person that is a character in one of your dreams. You've seen them before. I don't think that happens. Even if you don't remember, you've seen their face. It'll be in a film or it'll be in a magazine or in passing. We can't just generate random faces. I don't think so anyway. Maybe I'm wrong. But yeah, where would she have seen that face?
She knew she had never seen anybody like that before in her whole life. So how did her mind come up with this really vivid character?
Yeah, you'd be surprised.
But she ultimately just pushed this whole thing out of her mind and didn't talk to anybody about this experience. Well, that is until a few months later. Late one night in the spring of 1958, so a few months after Jean's death, Frances and her 46-year-old daughter, whose name was Jane, were driving down a freeway in Northern California, coming home from a road trip they had taken as sort of a celebration of Jean's life. And so as they're driving along, both women are looking out the window, they're not really talking, and the radio wasn't on, and so the only sound was the sound of the tires on the road. It was just very quiet. But then sort of out of nowhere, Jane spoke up and told her mother about something really weird that had happened to her on the morning of Jean's death. And she couldn't stop thinking about it, and it bothered her so much, she just had to tell her mom. According to Jane, she had woken up on that morning, and standing in her room on the other side was this little man with these strange polished shoes, striped pants, black coat with coattails, and these bright blue eyes, who was looking right at her and grinning.
Oh, no. Is he going to say that he's here for her mom?
And when Frances heard this, she couldn't believe it. And she blurted out to her daughter that she had never told anybody except for Jean, but on that morning, she had seen the exact same man in her bedroom. And so for the rest of the ride, the mother and daughter just compare notes, talking about the whole experience, exactly what they remember, exactly what he looked like, how they felt, like what they thought it meant. And then at some point, towards the end of this sort of revelation they're both having, where they're both realizing they've had this shared experience, Frances says something that catches Jane's attention. Frances says, yeah, and then, right before he vanished, he told me he was here for Jean. And then, your dad died 24 hours later. And Jane, when she heard this, she goes quiet and she looks at her mom and she's like, that's not what he said to me. And Frances is like, what do you mean? Like, what did he say to you? And Jane, she's just looking straight ahead. She's driving and she goes, he said, I'm here for Jane. He was here for me. For a moment, the car just went totally quiet. And neither woman knew what to say. But then Frances was like, well, wait a minute. I know the little man said to me, I'm here for Jean. And then 24 hours later, your dad died. Jean died. And so it sort of seemed like they were connected. And you're saying that the same thing happened to you. You've had the exact same experience as me on the same morning, the same time frame that I know he said, I'm here for Jean. And you think he said, I'm here for Jane? But you're still alive. And
but
that
you're
was months
Jane,
ago.
yeah.
You must have just misheard him. He must have said, I'm here for Jean, same as me, and you just thought he said Jane. And so pretty quickly, both women agreed that that had to have been what happened. They had the exact same experience, and in both cases, this guy has said he's here for Jean. Has to be what happened. However, Frances would be wrong. Because on December 7th, 1958, exactly a year and 1 day after Jean died, Frances's daughter, Jane, died as well. It would turn out she had not been perfectly healthy as she and her mother believed when she saw this little man in the strange outfit with the blue eyes. She had had cancer that likely had just cropped up but had gone undetected. And now, by the time doctors were realizing she had it, it was too late. It had spread to the point where there was nothing they could do. Following her daughter's death, Frances was so overcome with grief that she poured her energy into basically just telling everyone she could about this little man that she had seen before her husband's death and her daughter had claimed to have seen before she died. It just felt like, we gotta tell people about this, like what happened?
But no one else has
And she
seen
even
him.
ended up writing to a journalist to try to get this story out there, to try to figure out what the heck that was. However, nobody came forward with any sort of meaningful explanation about what this experience was, what it meant, how real it was. No one knew what to make of it. However, after getting the story out there and describing in agonizing detail every little thing that she remembered from this experience, Frances did learn one piece of information that does seem to begin to explain who this little man was. That man's outfit, the old-fashioned dress shoes, the striped pants, the white vest, the black coattails, is actually the uniform of a very specific profession.
An undertaker.
The little man with the blue eyes was dressed exactly like a 19th century undertaker.
Oh, I got chills.
Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time.
Glitches in the Matrix. Ooh. Ooh, I've had a request from Mr Ballen. I'll have to catch that video. I would love to binge watch all these videos, but I feel like I want to share them with you guys. I want to react to them instead. We'll get through the whole list eventually, guys. An undertaker, yes. I mean, they say they don't recognize the face of this man with the bright blue eyes. I think if it was delved into, maybe he's like Grunkle Eddie, or there's got to be. You don't invent faces. It's kind of weird though, isn't it? A year and a day after her dad passed away, and I can't explain that one. 3 very chilling stories there. They were great. Guys, I hope you enjoyed watching along with me. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.